August 12, 1944. The sun bled through the barbed wire horizon of Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The morning mist clung low to the ground, curling between wooden watchtowers where sentries stood with rifles slung, their eyes scanning the rows of barracks below. Inside, Japanese prisoners of war stirred from uneasy sleep, haunted by memories of Saipan, of Tarawa, of Pacific jungles soaked in blood and fire. For men trained to fight to the last breath, surrender was dishonor, a brand on the soul. Yet here in the heartland of America, something far stranger awaited them than punishment or cruelty. It arrived in the form of a green smell carried on the wind, fresh earth, cut stalks, vegetables pulled from the soil just minutes before. U.S. War Department Inspection Report Agchir in 1944. The prisoners at first believed it a trick. Food had been scarce in the island campaigns, rice rationed to bitter handfuls, water sometimes fouled with gasoline from shattered fuel drums. They had seen starvation in their own ranks and inflicted it on others. Yet now, in captivity, they were marched toward fields that seemed to stretch endlessly. Rows of cabbages glistening with dew, carrots sharp in color, beans hanging heavy on vines. To men raised on a strict military diet, drilled in the Emperor's service, the sight of American guards harvesting food alongside prisoners shattered expectations. This was not the brutality their officers had warned them of. It was something altogether alien, and in its strangeness terrifying. Bundesarchive, intercepted POW diary fragments 1945. The camp itself seemed built not just to contain men, but to confound them. Towering fences cut the horizon, yes, but inside those fences life bore a rhythm unlike the war. The clang of mess tins, the crack of baseball bats, the sound of farm trucks rolling in from the countryside. American soldiers, boys barely older than the prisoners themselves, laughed as they hauled baskets of tomatoes from the soil, their uniforms dirt-stained, their helmets set aside. They looked less like warriors and more like farm hands from another planet. One Japanese sergeant, his face lined with salt scars from the ocean crossing, whispered to another, "Why do they share food with us? Why do they give us what their own families could eat?" Dramatized composite, for men schooled to see surrender as a fate worse than death, the act of sharing fresh vegetables was not a kindness, but a riddle. In Japanese doctrine, prisoners were treated as shadows, stripped of dignity, often reduced to statistics before execution or starvation. The Imperial Army's own records showed no mercy on Bataan, no quarter in Nanking, and so when these men, captured in the Pacific and brought across the ocean, saw guards extending baskets of cucumbers, steaming pots of corn, they felt a dread unlike battle. Mercy was more disorienting than cruelty. U.S. Army Military Intelligence Service notes 1944. The sensory shock was overwhelming. The scent of crushed soil replaced the gunpowder stench of foxholes. The taste of boiled potatoes softened in butter clashed with memories of rice filled with worms. The crisp crunch of lettuce felt unreal, like biting into another world. One private, his hand trembling as he took a carrot, thought he was being mocked, that Americans had laced the food with poison. But when no one fell, when the guards themselves ate first and handed the rest over without hesitation, disbelief gave way to an emotion more dangerous: doubt. Doubt in everything they had been told about the enemy, doubt in the Emperor's voice, doubt in their own war. Japanese POW interrogation transcript, Fort McCoy, September 1944. At night, the camp hummed with whispers. Men spoke in low voices of the American farms that stretched beyond the wire. They had seen them from train windows, the endless rows of cornfields, the silos rising like towers, the barns painted red, the tractors crawling like metal beasts across the land. The abundance was staggering. In their homeland, shortages gnawed at cities, children grew thin, and rations dwindled with every convoy sunk by submarines. Here even the prisoners ate fresher food than Japanese civilians under blockade. That realization hollowed the heart. A war of steel and fire was one thing, but a war of harvest, a war of soil and factories, that was a weapon beyond imagination. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Agricultural Section, 1945. The guards themselves seemed oblivious to the psychological war they waged with vegetables and bread. To them, sharing food was procedure, part of a doctrine of humane treatment, a reflection of Geneva Convention obligations that America had chosen, unlike Japan, to follow. The young GIs carried rifles on their shoulders, but also baskets of beans in their hands. Some whistled as they worked the fields. Others traded jokes with farmers who came to supply the camp. To the prisoners, these small acts became magnified, distorted by cultural shock. Could men who smiled while handing out onions also drop firebombs over Tokyo? Could the nation that grew this much food truly be defeated? War Department Prisoner Administration Report, 1944. The contradictions ate away at the steel discipline instilled by the Imperial Army. Some men refused to eat, clinging to notions of honor, but hunger gnawed at them. Others ate greedily, tears burning their eyes as the taste carried them back to home villages, to family gardens, to memories of peace. A corporal wrote in his hidden journal, later found in the archives, "I do not understand the Americans. They kill us in the Pacific. They drown us at sea. And here they feed us like brothers." Recovered POW diary, Nara collection. Even among the guards, unease stirred. They knew these men had once fought ferociously, had bayoneted comrades, had ambushed patrols in jungles. Yet when the prisoners bent over rows of spinach, the line between captor and captive blurred. Sweat mixed on brows, dirt-coated hands on both sides. Work replaced war, if only for hours. The clash of empires shrank into the silence of fields, punctuated by the rhythm of shovels breaking ground. It was not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but something rawer, stranger, born in the soil itself. U.S. Army Agricultural Labor Program, 1944. By late summer, rumors spread like wildfire inside the camp. Some prisoners believed the vegetables were evidence of American trickery, designed to fatten them before execution. Others whispered that Americans shared because they had so much, they could not possibly lose the war. The fields became a mirror, reflecting not just abundance but destiny. And in the still nights, as cicadas hummed and searchlights cut the darkness, men who had once screamed Tenohaka Banzai on burning beaches now dreamed of farms, of soil, of a world where survival came not from the sword but from the seed. Military Intelligence Report on POW Morale, Decca, 1944. What they could not yet know was that these small moments, these carrots, these beans, these baskets of corn, were more than rations. They were instruments of psychological warfare, weapons more subtle than bombs, breaking belief without spilling blood. And as the seasons shifted, as snow crept down from the Wisconsin hills, the prisoners would face an even greater revelation about the America that held them, one that no officer of the Imperial Army had ever prepared them to imagine. The cliffhanger hung over the camp like a storm cloud. If America had this much food to spare for its enemies, then what terrible abundance awaited its soldiers at the front? The year was 1944, and the Pacific War had entered its most brutal phase. From Saipan to Leyte, from the Marianas to the Philippines, the Japanese Empire was losing ground. Yet in Tokyo, the broadcasts and official communiques spoke of imminent victory, of a divine wind that would sweep away the enemy. For the soldiers now behind barbed wire in the American Midwest, the contradiction between propaganda and lived reality grew sharper with each passing day. They had been told the United States was a fractured society, soft, racially divided, incapable of sustaining a long war. What they saw in captivity was an empire of factories and fields, producing not only bullets and bombers, but also fresh food in quantities unthinkable back home. U.S. Office of War Information Report, 1944. The war situation was grim for Japan. By 1943, its navy had suffered catastrophic losses at Midway and the Solomon Islands. Entire carrier groups had been sent to the ocean floor. The Imperial Army still held vast swathes of Asia, but its supply lines stretched thin, bleeding resources. Rice shipments from Southeast Asia dwindled under the constant harassment of American submarines. Civilian rations in Tokyo were cut to half what they had been in 1941, and malnutrition spread like a shadow across the home islands. In contrast, the United States mobilized not only its industry but its agriculture. Fields in Iowa, Nebraska, and Wisconsin yielded surpluses of wheat, corn, and vegetables, enough to feed its military, its civilian population, and, astonishingly, even its prisoners. Japanese Ministry of War Ration Records, 1944. Commanders on both sides understood the war was not only a clash of armies, but a collision of doctrines. Japanese military culture revolved around Bushido, the way of the warrior, where surrender was anathema. To fight to the death was the highest honor. To fall captive was to abandon one's soul. The Americans, however, adhered to the Geneva Convention of 1929, a treaty Japan had signed but never ratified. To the U.S. Army, humane treatment of prisoners was not merely law, but a reflection of national identity, proof that democracy could fight and still hold to principle. Thus, camps like Fort McCoy and Camp Clarinda became theaters of psychological combat, where food and dignity undermined the very foundations of imperial propaganda. War Department Circular No. 15, POW Subsistence Standards 1944. This hidden advantage extended beyond morale. It shaped strategy. While Japan gambled on decisive battles, America waged a war of attrition, confident that its industrial and agricultural reserves could outlast any storm. Every submarine that sank a Japanese transport tightened the noose of hunger around the empire. Every harvest in the Midwest widened the gap between abundance and desperation, and the prisoners eating from that harvest became unwilling witnesses to the imbalance. U.S. Navy Submarine Patrol Report 1944. The revelation was slow, painful, and undeniable. In the jungles of the Pacific, Japanese soldiers had fought with desperation, bayonets fixed, willing to die for lack of food. In the camps of Wisconsin, they ate cabbages and potatoes that came in endless supply. The hidden advantage was not just American steel or firepower. It was the silent engine of agriculture, the inexhaustible well of food that allowed America to fight a global war without hunger. And for the prisoners who tasted it, the revelation was devastating. Yet the full scale of this advantage remained hidden, even from them. They had only glimpsed the surface, the vegetables on their plates, the farms beyond the wire. What they had not yet seen was the machine itself, the technology, the science, the numbers behind the abundance. That revelation was coming, and it would strike as hard as any shell on a battlefield. The machine of abundance had gears made not of steel alone, but of soil, sweat, and science. Behind every steaming pot of corn served in a Wisconsin POW camp stood an empire of logistics and engineering. America had transformed farming into an industry as exacting as aircraft production. The numbers told a story sharper than any bayonet. In 1944, U.S. farms produced 3.2 billion bushels of corn, 1.1 billion bushels of wheat, and over 22 million tons of vegetables, figures that dwarfed the agricultural output of the Japanese Empire by more than tenfold. U.S. Department of Agriculture Statistical Yearbook, 1945. The prisoners noticed details. Tractors the size of small tanks rolled through fields with mechanical certainty, replacing the plodding oxen and wooden plows of their villages. These machines, like the John Deere Model A, weighed nearly 3,300 pounds, ran on gasoline and pulled steel plows that cut the soil with a precision no hand labor could match. A single machine could till 30 acres in a day. To a Japanese conscript raised on terraced paddies, where men bent double in mud from sunrise to dusk, the sight was otherworldly. Technical Manual TM 1030, 1943. Storage was another revelation. Grain silos towered above the fields like fortresses, some more than 80 feet tall, holding thousands of bushels in airtight chambers. Refrigerated trucks, powered by compressors and coolant lines, transported perishable vegetables from farm to camp in days, keeping them crisp and fresh. Japan, blockaded and starved, had nothing comparable. Their food rotted in tropical heat or sank with convoys. American engineers had solved the problems of preservation, turning perishables into weapons of endurance. U.S. War Food Administration Logistics Report, 1944. Factories blurred the line between farm and arsenal. The same Detroit plants that produced Sherman tanks also turned out tractors and harvesters. The International Harvester Model M, weighing over 5,000 pounds and generating 33 horsepower, could harvest corn at speeds unimaginable to manual labor. General Electric designed irrigation pumps that drew thousands of gallons of water per hour, feeding crops across the plains. Even chemical giants like DuPont contributed, manufacturing synthetic nitrogen fertilizers that boosted yields beyond what nature alone could offer. War Production Board Industrial Allocation Records, 1944. The prisoners did not see the laboratories, but they felt their work in every bite. At Iowa State College, plant geneticists had refined hybrid corn strains that yielded nearly double the harvest of traditional seed. At the University of Wisconsin, soil scientists perfected crop rotation schedules that replenished nitrogen and maximized output. These were engineers of the invisible battlefield, fighting hunger with equations, experiments, and test plots rather than rifles. For every bomber lifting off a runway, there was a professor in a lab coat ensuring the men inside would never starve. U.S. Department of Agriculture Extension Service Report 1943, comparisons were brutal. Japanese rice paddies yielded an average of 35 bushels per acre. American cornfields yielded over 60 bushels per acre, and with hybrid varieties, the number rose higher still. Japanese transport ships lost over 8 million tons of cargo to American submarines between 1943 and 1945, choking supply lines. Meanwhile, American trains hauled harvests across thousands of miles in hours, shielded by the continent itself. To a soldier raised on the imperial creed of sacrifice through hunger, the realization was crushing. Their enemy fought not with desperation, but with surplus. U.S. Navy Submarine Warfare Report 1945. Technical manuals, written with cold precision, underscored the scale. The Quartermaster Corps prescribed 3,200 calories daily for each POW, meals often including bread, potatoes, beans, and vegetables. Compare this to the Imperial Japanese Army ration, which averaged 1,800 calories, often reduced further in the field. In practice, American prisoners in Japanese camps suffered on less than 1,200 calories a day, leading to emaciation and death. The difference was not merely logistical, it was ideological. America chose to feed even its captives. Japan chose to starve them. Technical Manual TM 10405, U.S. Army Subsistence 1943. Even the tools of transport told their own story. In the United States, refrigerated rail cars, reefers, carried milk, meat and vegetables from coast to camp, each capable of holding 50,000 pounds of produce, chilled by mechanical cooling units. Japan's railways, strained by fuel shortages and constant bombing, could barely sustain their military needs. By 1944, even coal shipments faltered, leaving civilians shivering in winter. To the POWs eating boiled cabbage in Wisconsin, the contrast was not academic. It was a living wound. U.S. Office of Defense Transportation Report 1944. Production lines themselves became psychological weapons. Willow Run in Michigan produced one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. But surrounding counties also produced tens of thousands of tons of food each week. The sight of American abundance, steel in the skies, corn in the ground, was overwhelming. Prisoners whispered among themselves, how could an empire that relied on conquest to feed itself ever hope to defeat one that could arm and feed the world at the same time? War Production Board Annual Summary, 1944. For the engineers and farmers, this was routine. For the prisoners, it was revelation. They began to write about tractors in their hidden diaries, about silos taller than watchtowers, about guards who spoke casually of 10-acre yields as though describing a morning's chores. To them, this was sorcery, a weapon no general in Tokyo had prepared them to face. The imperial doctrine had no answer to machines that harvested bread as swiftly as bullets, to factories that produced sustenance with the same efficiency as tanks, and so the hidden advantage revealed itself in the open. Technology had turned American soil into an arsenal more devastating than guns. The prisoners could taste it in every meal, see it in every convoy of farm trucks, feel it in the very air they breathed, heavy with the scent of harvest. Yet numbers and machines were only the foundation. The true test of this hidden advantage would come on the battlefield, where abundance translated into endurance, where fresh food reached soldiers fighting thousands of miles from home. The prisoners had seen the machinery. Now they would hear the stories of battles where American troops, fueled by an empire of agriculture, fought with strength that no starving soldier could match. November 20th, 1943. The sky over Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll, burned with tracer fire and smoke. At dawn, U.S. Marines waded through surf red with blood, their packs heavy, their rifles clutched above the waves. The Japanese defenders had sworn to die to the last man, and most did, hurling grenades from bunkers, unleashing machine gun fire across the beaches. The battle would last just 76 hours, but it would cost nearly 6,400 lives. Yet among the carnage, one truth emerged in after-action reports. The Americans kept fighting with relentless stamina, supplied and fed even under fire. The Japanese, in contrast, had been weakened by weeks of shortages. Their rice rations were gone, their water fouled, their strength fading before the first Marine set foot on the reef. U.S. Marine Corps After-Action Report, Tarawa, November 1943. The POWs in Wisconsin heard whispers of these battles through interrogators, camp rumors, and censored letters. They learned how their comrades at Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam had fought valiantly, but always against an enemy who never seemed to tire. At Saipan in June 1944, American soldiers landed with rations packed in tins, cans of Spam, powdered milk, even chocolate. They fought with bellies full. Japanese soldiers, defending an island cut off from supply, boiled grass, ate roots, and scavenged the dead. Diaries recovered after the battle spoke of soldiers collapsing from hunger even before combat began. Captured Japanese diary, Saipan, June 1944. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, logistics became destiny. American task forces surged forward with 700 ships, each stocked with food as well as fuel and ammunition. Japanese sailors, already weakened by malnutrition, fought bravely but with fading strength. A Japanese petty officer later confessed under interrogation, "We believed we could match their courage. But they had rice and meat. We had only courage." Dramatized composite. U.S. Navy interrogation of Japanese POWs. 1944. The first major example the prisoners at Camp McCoy discussed among themselves was Saipan. There 71,000 U.S. troops landed against 31,000 Japanese defenders. American soldiers consumed more than 100 tons of supplies daily, dropped ashore by Higgins boats and amphibious tractors. These included 500,000 cans of sea rations and 2 million chocolate D-bars distributed during the campaign. Japanese records recovered after the battle revealed defenders receiving less than 700 calories a day during the final week. By the time the Americans closed in, many defenders could barely hold their rifles. U.S. Army Quartermaster Report, Saipan, July 1944. The contrast extended even to the sea. American submarines prowling Japan's supply routes had sunk nearly half of all cargo bound for garrisons across the Pacific. By mid-1944, Japanese soldiers on isolated islands dug up tree roots to survive. Meanwhile, U.S. carriers sailed with refrigerated compartments storing beef, milk, and vegetables, feeding sailors 3 hot meals daily. One Japanese prisoner at McCoy, recalling the sinking of his transport ship, wept as he described starving comrades who never reached the battlefield. "We were defeated before we fought," he admitted. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Naval Interrogations 1945. The battlefield consequences were devastating. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, Japanese soldiers defended the island with near-suicidal tenacity, yet their rations dwindled to 2 rice balls a day. American Marines stormed Mount Suribachi with canned rations in their packs, combat engineers delivering hot coffee under fire. A war correspondent recorded, "The Japanese fought like ghosts, emaciated, hollow-eyed, still deadly but already beaten by hunger." Associated Press Battlefield Dispatch, February 1945. The POWs understood this more deeply than most. They saw it mirrored in their own meals, the abundance of American agriculture, feeding even those who had once tried to kill its sons. They read censored clippings from U.S. newspapers describing supply convoys, railroads moving wheat, Liberty ships ferrying grain across oceans. They compared these to the hunger letters from home, families begging for rice, mothers skipping meals for children. The battlefield was not only in Saipan or Leyte. It was in every kitchen, every farm, every silo. Office of War Information, Press Digest, 1944. Enemy confusion was recorded in after-action reports. Japanese officers interrogated after Saipan and Guam admitted they could not understand how Americans kept their soldiers supplied in jungle terrain and across oceans. One captain said, dramatized composite, "We were told America was soft, that its men could not endure hardship, yet they arrived with food, with medicine, with endless supplies. It was like fighting a nation of giants." Military Intelligence Service Interrogation Report, 1944. The prisoners in Wisconsin, many veterans of these very campaigns, wrestled with shame. They remembered comrades collapsing from hunger in foxholes, remembered gnawing on leather belts, remembered hallucinations from dehydration. Now they ate vegetables fresher than anything their families could find in Tokyo. They realized that battles were not lost only by bullets and bombs, but by empty stomachs. Recovered POW diary, Camp McCoy archive. The American advantage in food became a ghost on the battlefield, haunting Japanese formations. Soldiers marched slower, fought shorter, and surrendered faster when their bodies gave out. The Americans marched longer, fought harder, and recovered quicker, fueled by an empire of abundance. In battle after battle, this imbalance grew until even the most indoctrinated prisoner could no longer deny it. And so the POWs, working in fields under watchtowers in Wisconsin, came to understand the truth. The fresh vegetables in their hands were not kindness alone. They were echoes of Saipan, Tarawa, Iwo Jima. They were proof that America's fields reached farther than its fleets. That abundance itself was a weapon. But the greatest impact of this hidden advantage was not measured in bushels or calories alone. It was measured in minds, in the psychological collapse of men who realized their empire had no answer to America's harvest. The final revelation awaited them, not just how this abundance shaped battles, but how it reshaped the very psychology of war, and how its legacy endured long after the last shot was fired. By the spring of 1945, the war was collapsing around Japan like a burning house. Cities were turned to ash under firebomb raids. Fuel stores bled dry. Convoys vanished beneath submarine attacks. Yet in the quiet corners of the American Midwest, thousands of Japanese prisoners ate 3 meals a day, each plate stacked with bread, potatoes, beans, and fresh vegetables. For these men, the shock was not only physical but psychological. They had been trained to believe captivity meant humiliation, starvation, or execution. Instead, they found themselves eating better than many of their families back home. U.S. War Department Prisoner Administration Report 1945. The impact was corrosive. Interrogation summaries reveal prisoners struggling with the dissonance. One corporal whispered during questioning, dramatized composite, "If this is America in war, then what will it be in peace? Our empire cannot compete." Another confessed that the greatest defeat was not on Saipan or Guam, but inside his own mind, as every meal stripped away another layer of indoctrination. Military Intelligence Service POW Debrief 1945. American strategists recognized this psychological front. Feeding prisoners well was more than compliance with Geneva law. It was a weapon. The U.S. Army knew stories would spread. Prisoners who survived captivity would return home carrying memories of abundance, undermining faith in Japan's militarist myths. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey later concluded that humane treatment of POWs had been an unplanned yet effective psychological operation, planting seeds of doubt that would sprout in post-war Japan. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. The legacy of this abundance shaped both sides. For America, it reinforced a self-image, a nation that could fight a total war and still uphold humanitarian ideals. The memory of feeding enemies became part of the narrative of moral victory, a contrast to the horrors of Japanese and German camps. Veterans recalled with pride not only battles won but principles upheld. For the prisoners, the memory cut deeper. Some never spoke of it, ashamed that they had eaten vegetables from enemy fields. Others told their families quietly that America was not the monster they had been taught to hate. Oral history interview, Japanese POW 1972. The psychological weight extended into strategy. Allied interrogators reported shifts in morale among prisoners. Fewer vows of eternal loyalty to the emperor, more confessions of doubt, more willingness to provide information. The collapse of faith was not immediate, but it spread like cracks in glass. Abundance quietly and relentlessly eroded resistance. Military Intelligence Psychological Warfare Report, March 1945. Post-war Japan bore the scars of hunger. In 1946, millions faced starvation as fields lay ruined, and supply lines shattered. American occupation forces distributed food aid, including wheat and powdered milk, feeding children who might not have survived otherwise. The memory of vegetables shared in POW camps now echoed in schools and homes across the ruined empire. Abundance had not only defeated Japan, it was now rebuilding it. U.S. Occupation Food Relief Report 1946. Veterans remembered the paradox. They had fought an enemy who killed them with bombs, but fed them with carrots. One former prisoner, interviewed decades later, said, I could not understand why the Americans gave us food when our own army had left us to starve. His voice trembled, not with anger, but with a lifetime of confusion turned into reluctant respect. NHK Oral History Project 1985. This legacy extended into the Cold War. American strategists studied the lessons of food as power. The Marshall Plan in Europe and food aid to Asia were guided by the same principle. Abundance was not only survival, it was persuasion. Feeding could be as decisive as fighting, from the Korean War to Vietnam, from Berlin to Baghdad. The echoes of those vegetables in POW camps reverberated through policy. U.S. State Department Food Security Strategy Memo, 1947. The prisoners who returned home carried memories that could never be erased. They had seen the face of an empire that fought with bread as well as bullets. For some, it broke their faith. For others, it sowed a bitter respect. But all understood a truth their commanders had hidden from them. America's strength was not only its machines, its carriers, its firebombs, it was its harvest. Japanese POW Repatriation Report, 1946. In the end, the story of fresh vegetables in POW camps was not trivial. It was a symbol of the larger war, a clash between scarcity and abundance, between a doctrine of sacrifice and a doctrine of supply. Japan had gambled on spirit, on courage, on the will to endure hunger. America had gambled on machines, on logistics, on feeding even its enemies, and history proved which gamble would win. One interrogator summarized it bluntly after the war. They could not believe we gave them fresh food, because their empire could not imagine it. That was their defeat before the war was even over. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Psychological Warfare Division, 1946. The lesson endures. In modern war, firepower matters, but it is the unseen engines, food, fuel, logistics that decide victory. Abundance itself is a weapon, and in 1944, behind the fences of American POW camps, Japanese prisoners discovered the most devastating truth of all. The enemy's strength was not hate, but harvest. Snow fell thick over Camp McCoy in December 1944, blanketing the barbed wire in silence. Inside the barracks, Japanese prisoners huddled against the cold, steam rising from their breath. Guards marched between towers, stamping their boots against frost. The war was far away now. Saipan, later Iwo Jima. But its echoes were in every letter home, every whispered rumor, every intercepted broadcast. For the men inside the wire, the war was ending not with a final charge or a glorious death, but with bowls of soup and baskets of vegetables grown in the very soil of their enemy. U.S. Army POW Camp Daily Log, 1944. The strategic impact of America's abundance was undeniable. While Japanese cities starved under blockade, prisoners thousands of miles from home tasted food their families could not find. The contradiction was unbearable. One prisoner later confessed, dramatized composite, "In the camp, I ate better than my wife in Tokyo. That knowledge was more painful than the barbed wire." Japanese POW Oral History, 65. The shame ate into loyalty. Some prisoners began to question whether the emperor's war was just. Others clung harder to their faith, refusing meals, seeing abundance as an enemy trick. Either way, the psychological damage was done. For American commanders, this was victory without bullets. Feeding prisoners became part of the war of perception. Reports filed with the War Department noted that POW morale shifted dramatically when meals were plentiful. Some men even volunteered information during interrogations, not under torture, but after weeks of steady rations that stripped away fear and rebuilt trust in small, dangerous increments. Military Intelligence Service Psychological Warfare Report, Jan 1945. In the quiet of Wisconsin farms, America had discovered a weapon as potent as steel, the power of food to break the enemy's spirit. The prisoners themselves carried this legacy home. In 1946, as repatriation ships ferried them back to shattered ports, they whispered stories of American farms, of fresh vegetables, of guards who shared food instead of hoarding it. For some, these stories were buried in silence, never told in families still mourning sons lost to hunger. For others, they became seeds of doubt, planted deep in post-war soil. In a society rebuilt under occupation, with American wheat feeding schoolchildren, those seeds sprouted into something new, a recognition that victory was not only about courage or sacrifice, but about logistics, abundance, and the ability to sustain life even in war. U.S. Occupation Food Distribution Report 1946. The psychological impact extended far beyond the barbed wire. Allied reports noted that Japanese civilians, hearing of POW conditions, began to question wartime propaganda. How could America feed its prisoners when Japan could not feed its people? The question, whispered in black markets and burned-out homes, carried more weight than any leaflet dropped from the sky. It was a dagger into the myth of invincibility, proof that Japan had gambled on spirit, while America had mastered sustenance. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Civilian Morale Report 1946. The legacy of this hidden advantage did not end with surrender. In the Cold War years, food became central to strategy. America launched the Marshall Plan in Europe, shipping wheat and corn across the Atlantic, not only to feed allies but to prove that democracy itself was tied to abundance. In Asia, food aid stabilized Japan, reshaping a former enemy into a partner. The lesson was clear: bread could conquer where bullets failed. U.S. State Department Policy Planning Report 1947. For veterans and their families, the memory lingered in quiet stories. Some spoke of the surreal moment when enemies shared meals. Others remembered the bitter irony of eating American vegetables while their own children starved in Tokyo. And for American guards, the memory was one of pride, that even in the darkest war, they had upheld a principle that the enemy could not fathom. Veterans Oral History Collection, Wisconsin Historical Society. The psychological impact was twofold: despair in the Japanese heart, pride in the American. For the prisoners, abundance became a mirror reflecting the empire's weakness. For the Americans, it became proof that their system, factories, farms, freedoms, was unshakable. The war was not just won on beaches or in skies, but in kitchens, fields, and mess halls. And so the story closes not with gunfire, but with a universal truth. In modern war, strength is not measured only in firepower. It is measured in the ability to sustain life, to feed armies, civilians, and even captives. In the 20th century's greatest conflict, America's most devastating weapon was not its bombers or its battleships, it was its harvest. As one U.S. officer later reflected in 1946, words half pride and half warning, we defeated them with wheat as surely as with steel. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. In the silence of Camp McCoy as snow drifted over the fences, that truth lingered like smoke over the battlefield. Abundance itself is victory, and hunger is defeat. And from that winter on, every soldier and every prisoner understood the wars of the future would not only be fought with bullets, but with bread.